Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It was a year ago today that we actually had our inaugural Halaqa for the Usuli Institute, which is amazing. I was looking at the calendar, I was like, oh my God, how did we pass a year already? And a lot has happened, and I'm really happy to say, we have struck a chord, I think, with people, and we have a lot of people who are very interested and write us very lovely messages about how happy they are that we're doing what we're doing. And quite frankly, it's like when we started this, we really had no idea whether anyone would really even care about what we were doing. I hope that we have tried to do our best in being sort of the voice of beauty and reasonableness and depth of knowledge, and how important that is in affecting how we understand Islam and how we live that in our day-to-day. And we've made modest progress in the year. People have asked, how are we doing? And so when I look on YouTube and I see that, we've probably averaged about 2 educational events per month, so about 24 months. And we've had about 21,500 views, which is, not a whole lot, but if you think about it, it's about 900 people per session, which is pretty good. If you can fill an auditorium of 900 people every time you have an event, that's a pretty good thing. And also about 60 people a day. So, if you think about it, if we haven't been doing this, then those are people that really have not had a chance to learn something or hopefully been inspired. So, and I'm so grateful, that we're here and we're continuing. This is a labor of love. And for those of you who are new to what we do here at the Institute, this library and this backdrop and what we do is really kind of a formalization of a lifelong work and a dedication to books and knowledge, and trying to show that, there is so much beauty in this tradition. And one of the things that I'm personally very grateful for, and sort of an unintended outcome, was that at the beginning of each of these halaqas, I've had a chance to kind of share some thoughts and stories and ideas, and about how kind of this work has changed my life. Because I'm not a scholar, as I often say, but what really matters to me is, what does it really mean to be Muslim in 2018? Like, we know that core to Islam is beauty and love and mercy and compassion and justice and all of the beautiful qualities. But what does that really mean for me living as a Muslim? And so I've had, I was sort of shy to speak at the very beginning, and I kind of went back and played back some of the early halaqas, and I was like, oh, as my son would say, he's 13, that's so cringeworthy. So I had to look at myself and I'm like, oh my God, okay, this is sort of embarrassing. Because when I started speaking, it was like, well, I didn't really feel like I had a right to say anything, and I kind of, wanted to defer to my husband, the scholar. And I was really, grateful that people came forward and said, the piece that you add is actually really valuable. And speaking as a woman and as a convert and kind of as a non-scholar, so, I wanted to take that opportunity to, kind of tell sort of the personal stories. So I decided that, okay, in the last month, if I'm really grateful for this experience, because it's I think, for Muslim organizations, it is unusual for women to be able to speak out. And unfortunately, and I hope that that will change in the future, but I hope, I want to try and set a better example. So I decided, okay, I needed to become a better public speaker. So last month I read a book on TED Talks, and I started watching TED Talks online. Do people know what TED Talks are? They're amazing. If you don't know what they are, they're like short, very powerful videos that took advantage of YouTube. And so the premise was that we would get the experts in every field, and people can kind of express the essence of what their specialty is in about 20 minutes or less. And it's for non-specialists, so they can really understand, like, okay, if you're going to talk about whatever topic you are a specialist in, that you can just share the gold from that. So I started by looking at, what are the top 25 TED Talks of all time. And I saw that in the top 5, there was one called the power of vulnerability. So I thought, oh, that's really interesting. You know, it's a woman named Brené Brown, and you can look it up. It's sort of interesting. Her research is, she's a social worker, and she studies human connectedness. So she's really interested in, like, you know, how do we increase things like empathy and courage and, you know, humanity. And it's like, oh, that's the kind of stuff we talk about here. So I definitely wanted to hear what she had to say. So in a nutshell, I mean, it's a really interesting talk, and she's funny and all of that stuff. It's engaging. So her research is that in understanding human connectedness, she was able to do a lot of research and kind of parse people into two groups. So the people that were really good at feeling connected to humanity were the people who felt worthiness or worthy to be loved. And the people who felt like they had issues with human connectedness were people who didn't feel worthy to be loved. And it was really just that one variable that made the difference between the two. And that people who didn't feel worthy had struggled with shame and fear and sort of this idea of extreme vulnerability. So she really wanted to kind of delve deeper into that and say, okay, well, what is it that makes people feel worthy? So she kind of set aside the group that struggles with shame and fear and says, okay, well, let's look at the group that feels worthy. And what is it about them that makes them feel able to feel connected? And it was this issue of vulnerability. So, and authenticity. And so her argument is, if you want to live a full life, you should live as your authentic self. You should be able to feel vulnerable, and you should live loving with your whole heart, which sounds very good, and it's very nice for people who already feel that they're worthy to be loved, because most likely they're people who are fairly comfortable in their skin. They don't really have, you know, they feel like they can love people and they can take risks. But for the people that she set aside, which were the people that dealt with shame and fear, you really can't just tell them, you should just start feeling less vulnerable. You should embrace your vulnerability. You should just believe that you need to be loved. So, but she kind of set them aside and kind of kept going from there. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. So I'll come back to that research in a bit. Secondly, in about the last week or so, separate story that will kind of connect. I had a friend on Facebook who invited me, a Muslim friend, who invited me to like his new page, and it's called Luminary, L-O-O-M-I-N-A-R-Y. And the premise of that is that we live in an age where we are more connected than ever before, but we feel more lonely than ever before. And, you know, why is that? You know, it's because, and there's a video that kind of describes what they're trying to do, and it's like the idea of neoliberalism and storytelling. So we live in an age of neoliberalism, which means extreme individualism, where society is the market, and we as individuals are commodities, and we're trying to sell ourselves because we're taking pictures and selfies and trying to get likes and shares, and that, you know, through that whole process, we're feeling sort of an emptiness. And then he comes to this and says, the way that we deal with this is we want to create a vehicle where people can share their stories. So they want to use the online vehicle and say, you know, we really want to be authentic, again. We want to show vulnerability, and we want to create community, or again, the idea of human connectedness. So it's really interesting because, you know, the first Brené, the TED Talk was from 2010, and she's had 37 million plus views. So clearly somebody, you know, people are very interested in this idea of how do we create connectedness and meaning and authenticity and, you know, and vulnerability. And those same words are now used in this new effort here in 2018, and trying to use that vehicle to share stories. So I thought, you know, these are interesting efforts, and I wanted to comment on them from a Muslim perspective, because as a Muslim, when I watch these things, the one thing that just screams out to me is, you're missing the role of God and the role of the divine and divinity in this process. For Muslims, you know, obviously that's something that's very important because, you know, especially here with the work we do, you know, God is sort of the beginning and the end, and it's, you know, God is your partner, and God is, you know, your power, and it's kind of like asking you to look for authenticity or seek something and not really having, you know, eyes. So, you know, it's, so, you know, when we talk about things like authenticity from a Muslim perspective, for me, authenticity is about understanding your true self and knowing, like, you know, what are the God-given gifts that you have? What are your strengths, your weaknesses? Interestingly, when we were doing this Halaqa a few months ago over the summer, I asked people, here, how many people know what your gifts are or what your purpose is, your God-given gifts? And I was really surprised that in a room like this size, I think only 2 people raised their hands. So let me ask you guys here, how many people here feel like you know what your God-given gift is, your purpose here? 1, 2. 3, 4, 4.5. Okay. Well, to believe as, one of the things that really made me fall in love with Islam was this idea that, everyone has a purpose, a God-given strength and a God-given gift. You have strengths and you have weaknesses. And so the first thing in trying to understand what is your authentic self and what is that true, your true self, is you have to know yourself. And we know from our tradition that if you want to know your God, you begin by knowing yourself. So, this is like, okay, do you have the soul of an artist, but you're trying to become a doctor, or you're being forced to be an engineer because you feel like for whatever reason that's what you need to do. Part of it is understanding, like, what are your special talents, what are your special gifts, what are the things that you're good at and you're passionate about. So that's sort of, to me, like the idea of authenticity. Moving to vulnerability, I see it as sort of the flip side of that same coin. And vulnerability is sort of the idea of being honest with yourself and understanding not just what you're good at, but who you are as a person. What is your accountability? What are you capable of in terms of creating good and not creating good? So as an example, when I became Muslim, one of the really important things that Dr. Abou El Fadl guided me through in trying to find out who I was is really taking a actually I'm going to quote AA, which is a wonderful model for, I think, a way of understanding yourself as a person. A fearless moral inventory, and understanding what are those things that you actually avoid that make you feel vulnerable. And it's like taking that stuff and confronting it head on. So it's like, what is it that, for example, you have a tendency to do? Or that, okay, well, let me make it a real example. So I had a problem with always seeing myself as the victim in any situation. It was much easier for me to blame, whatever happened on someone else and not accept my own responsibility or accountability in that. And that became sort of a means for shame and covering up, because anytime I would do something I didn't want to accept responsibility for it, I would blame someone else and shove it under the rug. And part of becoming that authentic, honest self who is capable of vulnerability is confronting that shame and that fear and saying, okay, I am responsible for what I do. It's owning my accountability for who I am and saying, I can confront the sins that I've done and who I've hurt and what my role is in that, so I can learn that I'm not going to do that anymore, and I'm going to own it and I'm going to overcome it and I'm going to be a better person. And then you're able to be more vulnerable because you can be the first one to say, I'm an idiot. I'm responsible for this. And it frees you. It's like when people say the truth will set you free. That exercise, is an exercise in owning vulnerability. And all of that, so we talk, all of this is really just to say, change in our world really starts with changing ourselves. And we hear this all the time. But we have to start by understanding who are authentic, who we are, what our purpose is, what we're here for, what we have to contribute. And then what our vulnerability is. What are we ashamed of? What are we afraid of? And let's own it, clear it out. And then from that, then you can start building human connectedness. So, God plays a role because this is what God asks us to do. God asks us to be honest. God asks us to understand that, God created us to be beautiful, godly beings. God gave us, more than enough to be, to create goodness, and also the ability to create darkness. But if we own that, then we can rise above it and start to connect with other human beings. So I think that, and then the last thing is just that, there really is no substitute for human connectedness. I think that in an age where everything is digital and online, you really have to make an effort to connect with human beings. And, I find a lot of pleasure in trying to make people smile, like when I just deal with them, even walking across the street and seeing someone or opening a door for someone, because I feel like in an age where I'm always looking at my phone, it means so much to me when I can actually make someone smile. And I think you can't really make someone smile unless you're fully comfortable in your own skin. And so, you know, you have to do that hard work to, you know, own who you are and trust that, you know, God gave you the ability to connect with others. So anyway, just some thoughts, and thank you very much.
Welcome back, everyone. Inshallah, we will continue with the Quran. Today we will talk about Surah At-Takathur. I go back and just underscore that the revelation of the Quran was a pivotal point in human history, and as time goes by, it is critical that, let me rephrase that it's the relationship of Muslims to the Quran will always define where Muslims are in the world. History itself is the best indicator of that. The entire philosophical and intellectual and spiritual movement that started in the Islamic civilization, without which so much of what we take for granted in our intellectual and in our epistemological universe today, the worlds of meanings that we take for granted, would not have existed. The Islamic intellectual civilization was a critical bridge by which the entire philosophic universe of the Greek and Eastern philosophy from Egypt and from India and from Iran was reformulated and re-articulated and reconstructed and reinvented in a world of meanings that lifted humanity from the world of magical and superstitious thinking to a world in which it redefined reason, logic, philosophy, epistemology, and spiritualism in a truly transformative way. The Quran challenged and inspired human beings to think. And that civilizational spark, regardless of what we see in the contemporary world, was a revolutionary moment. And as we go through surahs, it is critical to remember that each surah that we've talked about, and again, if you haven't done so, and I encourage you to go back and listen to the Tafsir that preceded this one, has the potential of transforming your entire existence, we don't cover surahs simply moving on from one chapter to the other as if we are taking a walk in through satisfying intellectual curiosity. In every sense, if you just simply take Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad, Surah Al-Ikhlas, or Surah Al-Asr, or any of the surahs that we've talked about, it is a moral engagement that is truly transformative if you allow it to penetrate yourself and interrogate the way that you form your consciousness and that you engage your own consciousness. It is also important to remember that there's a lot to say about modernity and the epistemological moment that we live in. The irony of technological thinking is that it elevated individuality to heights unprecedented in human history. In many ways, it deified the individual. But at the same time that it did so, the irony of it, the paradox of it, is that it also alienated the individual and commodified the individual and turned the individual from a unique singular creation to something that can be commodified in the very logic and the type of logic that exists in assembly lines, where individuals become reduced to utilitarian units and so on. Now, the important thing, though, is that the role of the Quran is that it comes in this universe of individuality and subjectivity in which all of us exist within our own minds, and all of us are told, we are raised with the idea that as individuals we are the beginning and the end, and the entire universe exists through our eyes, and that but at the same time we are alienated by the fact that when we really think about our role, we find that our role is reduced to a commodified role in which you're given a credit rating, in which you are assessed through a set of a set of formalistic instruments like degrees and resumes and CVs, in which you are counted statistically in uniform fashions and so on. So the Quran comes in and intervenes with this subjectivity, and the role of a revealed text is that to precisely bring the voice of God into your life by engaging this revelation. So if you do not engage the revelation, if the Quran is not a companion, if the Quran is not a consistent friend, then all you have is your own frame of reference, which is as fleeting as a commodity that is consumed. The idea of a revealed text is a intervention in human subjectivity, but it resolves that paradox, that inconsistency between the celebration of individuality and at the same time the marginalization of individuality. This is philosophic sounding talk if the philosophy doesn't appeal to you, in saying that, to put it quite simply, the Quran needs to be a companion and a serious companion. if you read the Quran simply subjugating it or subverting it to your own subjective desires and projecting your subjective desires onto it, then it will not produce anything other than what you already have. It becomes simply a tapestry upon which you see yourself and nothing more. But the Quran is a book of moral teachings. And as we've talked about in the previous surahs, it's a revolutionary book of moral teachings because it invites you to think of the world as something beyond your momentary existence, and also see the world as interconnected from the here now and the hereafter. And so, Surah At-Takathur comes with a reminder. And first I'm going to just read the translation of the surah and then we'll break it down in the ayat, inshallah. So, many of us memorize Surah At-Takathur and repeat it in prayer, but we don't pause to think about what it actually challenges us to do. So, ألهاكم التكاثر حتى زرتم المقابر, competing for more. Okay, let me just get through the English. Competing for more distracts you until you visit the graves or until you go into your graves. No, indeed, you will come to know. No, indeed, you will come to know. No, indeed, if only you knew for certain, you would most definitely see hellfire. Then you will see it with the eye of certainty. And on that day, you will be held to account for the bounties or the pleasures or the na'im, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so straightforward enough, right? Competing has distracted you. And then Allah repeats several times, you will come to know. No, you will come to know. Indeed, you will come to know. And when you know, you will know for certain. Okay. So first, the Quran, there are, and this is sort of just a scholarly note, the Quran, there are certain transmitters of narrators, like Kalbi or Qatada and others, who played a key role in narrating what are often referred to as occasions for revelations or as Bab al-Nuzul. Now, there's a lot of debate, a lot of scholarly discussion about to what extent we can rely on the so-called occasions for revelations, and precisely what level of reliability each rawi, each narrator has. The narrations of Kalbi is in a class of their own, and narrations of Qatada is in a class of their own, and each narrator has a considerable amount of scholarly knowledge that you can delve into and you can study. And both Kalbi and Qatada in this situation, number one, there is debate about whether Surah At-Takathur was revealed in Mecca, or which is most likely that it was a Meccan revelation, or that it was revealed in Medina, and that's the minority view. Does that matter? Yes and no. It depends on how specialized you are in the study of the Quran. Some people, some especially Orientalists, claimed that the style of Meccan revelations is very different than the style of Medinian revelations, and this challenges that Orientalist view. We really don't have certain information as to what was revealed in Mecca and what was revealed in Medina. We simply have probable information. And in my view, it's probable that Surah At-Takathur was revealed in the Meccan period and not in the Medinian period. Okay, so according to Kalbi and Qatada, they tell us that there was an event during the life of the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Two Qurayshi tribes, they're known as Bani Abd Manaf and Bani Sahm, did what Arabs back then often did, and that is they started bragging about their honor and their greatness. And so Bani Abd Manaf and Bani Sahm got into an argument as to who's greatest. And according to them, in that debate, they started arguing about who has more noblemen in their lineage. And so, as the story goes, Bani Abd Manaf said, well, look, we have more noblemen, and noble here meant people by lineage or by wealth. We are greater than you, Banu Sam. And then Banu Sam said, well, if we count the noblemen who are alive and those who are dead, in other words, our noblemen in the past who have now died, we would be greater. And according to the story, Banu Sam demonstrate that they have greater noblemen or more noblemen alive and dead, and so on. And the Quran, the Surah At-Takathur, was revealed shortly after that event in order to condemn the entire dynamic. Now, what is it that it is condemning? It is condemning relying on ancestry and nobility to brag about merit. So it's as if Allah's intervention at that moment is to say, shame on you. Your tribal lineage and wealth should not be what you use in order to brag. And in fact, tribal bragging in itself condemned. Now, I must tell you that while I believe that that event took place, and while I believe that it was condemned through various sources by the Prophet ﷺ, I do not believe that that was the reason for revelation. And we won't get into the details why, but what is important here are the commentaries. I told you that the Quran inspired those, we could say it, uncivilized Arabs, and they weren't just Arabs, because many of the intellectuals that were inspired by the Quranic revelation and made critical interventions in our human culture were not Arabs. In fact, the majority of them were not Arabs ethnically. And so it is not surprising to know that many of the ideas that I'm going to talk about were by Persian thinkers and by Indian thinkers and by thinkers from Samarkand and Naishapur and so on. But the critical moral interjection here, which is affirmed in the Surah and affirmed by the Islamic revelation, is to condemn the practice that was, ironically, that not just really existed in the past but continues to exist today, of speaking in history in bragging terms. It is not the achievements of the past that define you as the achievements of now. And it's an irony when you look at the conditions of Muslims today, because it tells you that there is something wrong in the way we engage the Quran itself for modern Muslims. I'm reminded as an Egyptian, when I hear Egyptians often brag about their great Quranic tradition, I'm reminded of Surah At-Takathur. And because the fact that your ancestors created a great civilization is quite immaterial. They're dead. And the point is, what are you as living human beings doing? Now, you have to think that at the time that the Quran intervened in this fashion, in human thinking, it was quite revolutionary. Because now we have a lot of philosophers that have made this point. That, a lot of the self-help talks, I can't claim that I've studied TED Talks as Grace did, but I'm sure that a lot of TED Talks, they talk about, they pump you up as to your own achievement. But the principled moral intervention that the Quran made is, and the reason we have that narration about Banu Sam and Banu Abd Manaf and so on and so forth, is that the logic of tribalism itself is condemned. And again, it astounds me when you hear what is going on between Arabs and Persians today, when you look at the attitude of people who assess the value of others according to whether you're a Turk or an Arab or Persian or Indian and so on, you know that there is something that has gone awfully wrong. Because the very logic of tribalism and the very logic of referring to ancestors as the way of proving your merit was, as a paradigm, it is foundationally inconsistent with the Islamic revelation. In my mind, there is no way that you can be a Quranic human being and at the same time think in ethnic or racial or national terms. There is just a fundamental paradoxical inconsistency. The fact that modern Muslims do it, then you have to talk about Orientalism, and you have to talk about the intellectual colonization, and you have to talk about a lot of various factors, and you have to talk about the internal movements of Islamic history itself. That's a different matter. But as a principled moral stance, now what also is intriguing is that many of the people who commented on Surah At-Takathur go to great pains to cite certain movements within Islamic history, like the Shawbiya and like the whole experience with the Umayyad dynasty and so on, as in a self-critical engagement, as proof of the ways that Muslims themselves fail to live up to the Quranic challenge of shifting the focus of humanity from an ethnic affiliation and a tribal affiliation to an emphasis on moral deeds and moral insight. Okay, so the beginning, as is in the case with Quranic revelation in general, emotively, it is extremely powerful because it comes in with a simple, straightforward, but yet all-encompassing comment. Al-Hakum At-Takathur. Al-Hakum At-Takathur, there's a lot to comment on, but you have in a sort of a comment, and here the tense, the verb tense, applies individually and collectively. It's as if it's commenting to humanity that says, you have become preoccupied by Takathur. Takathur means whatever you whatever occupies you, whatever occupies you and distracts your attention from what it should not be focused on. So the word itself is brilliant, because you can't say At-Takathur in a context other than whatever you become, as it even implies an addictive quality. It's as if you have become addicted to something, addicted to an act that distracts your attention from what it ought to be focused on. So, and of course here we can probably guess what is it that we've become preoccupied with. And the answer, I think, is straightforward enough. As many have pointed out, including the Prophet ﷺ himself, in commenting on this verse. And as you know, most of the Quran, the Prophet does not comment on what it means. And we don't have hadiths that tell us what the Quran means most of the times. But Surah At-Takathur, we do have several hadiths attributed to the Prophet to one extent or another, in which the Prophet ﷺ does tell us what it refers to. So I'm going to skip over the narrations and just get to the meaning itself. That what any intellectually bad habit, and again, when you read this in medieval commentators, you're fascinated, because within modern epistemology and modern systems of knowledge, for people to talk about bad habits that degrade you as a human being is fascinating to me, because it took numerous philosophers of the West to get us to understand intellectual bad habits that degrade you as a human being. And the fact that these people are producing this thought at the time that they did is amazing to me. Bad habits, the prime suspects is money. You're addicted to the accumulation of money. You're addicted to bragging about your ethnicity, bil-asha'ir wal-qaba'il, by your clans and tribes and ethnicities and nationalist affiliations. Al-Hasan radiallahu anhu says that it includes children and awlad, that you brag and you focus about the accomplishments of your children. I think if you take the various narrations and the various commentaries, it is whatever preoccupies you from awareness of your true purpose in existence. So it's commenting on us as individuals and as human beings that we have a tendency, to put it simply, to become preoccupied with materialist existence, materialism. And that this At-Takathur, the brilliance of this word, is that it connotes an addictive quality, a self-perpetuating cycle. That once you fall into that trap, it perpetuates endlessly. And that is why one of the reports from the Prophet ﷺ about, in which he, when I say reports, that means he said a hadith and then he recited this surah, this chapter, in which the Prophet ﷺ says to the effect, human beings say, mali, mali, my money, and in truth, a human being owes nothing of their money except what they've consumed and what they wear and what they give in charity. In other words, what you consumed is what keeps you alive. And what you wear is what you cover your body and provides you with dignity. And what you give in charity is what remains for you in the hereafter. And again, if you knew the level of intellectual engagement that Muslims have with the Quran, it's profound. Because when you hear some people then reflect on this and say, well, even when you feed yourself, if you do it in a just fashion, that God rewards you for preserving your well-being on this earth. But the minute you go beyond fair usage, so you consume, you move from consuming for the purpose of self-preservation and health to excess, then God says, then you'll be held accountable for that, as we'll talk about in a second. In other words, even usage in terms of consuming food, or usage in terms of wearing clothes, if you wear clothes beyond what is needed for your contingent circumstance means the requirements of your moment, and you wear clothes where it becomes socially and morally irresponsible. And here I'm not talking about fitna, I'm talking about wearing clothes that other human beings cannot afford. And you do so with for instance, like fashion shows, where people wear things in order to brag and to demonstrate that they can afford what others cannot afford. And again, remember what we said about the mizan, and we had a long conversation about the mizan, the balance. The entire Quranic engagement with human beings is a calling, a hearkening back to the balance. A balance in everything. Now imagine if modern Muslims, as your ancestors, and we don't brag about our ancestors, we try to learn from our ancestors, and that's a huge difference. Imagine if modern human beings remembered that what you owe, what you can safely assume is among amal al-khair, or good deeds, is what you can consume fairly, but not beyond that. So gorging yourself, you have something to worry about. And what you can wear fairly, but not beyond that, and what you give in sadaqah, what you give in charity. Because what you consume fairly, you'll be rewarded for in the hereafter. And what you wear fairly, you will be rewarded for in the hereafter. And what you give in charity, you will be rewarded for in the hereafter. But anything beyond that is something that you will be held to account for. doesn't necessarily mean you'll be punished for it. It means you will have to justify it. Now, of course, as Ibn Arabi says, commenting on Surah At-Takathur, he says, if people understood what Surah At-Takathur challenges them to do, they would not be able to live in the same frame of mind another hour. He says, lahza, another moment. It makes you pause, and I often, and not just Surah Al-Takathur, but so much of the Quran harkens you back to that same message. A fully conscientious life. A conscientious life in all your engagement with others and with material existence. Now, and we'll talk about this in a second. We live, the Surah Al-Takathur tells us that we live in this state of addictive quality, of materialist propagation, in which we forget you forget what? You forget ta'atillah, you forget your relationship with Allah. And because if you remembered your relationship with Allah, it would draw you back to the balance. And if you truly internalize the balance, then consumption and giving, or fair consumption and giving in charity would become a preoccupation that balances out the addictive material propagation in which we often gravitate towards. You can say that there is an iron law of forgetfulness. An iron law meaning a law that is constantly there, that, and this is hawa nafs, the whimsy self, that constantly draws us away from the light towards darkness. The light is the divine, it's existence. Anything away from the right. Sahrawardi has a wonderful comment on Surah At-Takathur. Sahrawardi is known as the istishraqi, or the philosophy of light. And again, if you look at the Sahrawardi from what we know in modern knowledge, it's remarkable, because the Sahrawardi said all material existence is just variations in light. And at his time, it's amazing, it's brilliant. Because he saw entire existence as waves. And now we know scientifically that that's true. But and the Sahrawardi comments upon Surah At-Takathur and says it is whenever you are fully conscious of your state in a condition of balance, you are towards the light and towards the emanation, the true light, the divine. And whenever you, to whatever extent, even from one moment of another in the day, in the same way that in the day you might see a shade at this spot, and then the other moment the shade is gone and there's light, so is your human soul. It gravitates between levels of shades and levels of lights. One moment of the day you fully feel Allah. One moment you give because you remember that whatever material wealth you have is not yours. As the Prophet ﷺ reminded us, you really own nothing of it. And another moment, you feel selfish, and you feel covetous, and you feel stingy, and you don't want to give. And Sahrawardi says, it is your task is to constantly try to chase away the shades and draw closer to the light. But do not have the delusion that you can exist in light perpetually and endlessly. Because that, of course, we'll talk about what they say about what is required to reach that stage, but, you know, we can't kid ourselves. Very few of us. And in fact, those of us who try to believe that we constantly exist in light and we are immune from the shades of darkness, often it overtakes us a state of arrogance in which we mistake Allah for ourselves. And in that is the biggest fallacy of all. Okay. Now, as often the Quran does, it reminds us that there is a finality to everything. And it reminds us often of the obvious. It's as if, very much like when the Quran says that you simply do not see with your eyes. It's reminding us that you are as if blind, calling us to open our eyes. And what is it that we open our eyes to? حَتَّى زُرْتُمُ الْمَقَابِرِ, until you will visit the graves. Now, the meaning here is that until you die. That you are preoccupied with addictive qualities, drawing you away from the light until you're dead. And the finality of it is the death. Now, some of the Al-Arfaniyun commented on this by saying that a good Muslim should often visit the grave sites in order to remind themselves. I don't know. When there was a time when I would incessantly visit grave sites and spend a lot of times in grave sites. If you have the moral constitution for this to be an enlightening experience, drawing you closer to Allah, then do it. If your moral constitution is that you're going to become an manically depressed person, then don't do it. Visiting graves, not simply on the occasion of the death of loved ones, but reminding yourself that this is where you're going to end, is a healthy practice. Of course, we have a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, which is of dubious authenticity, that says, I had forbidden you from visiting the graves, but then I was told otherwise by Allah, so now you may visit it. That hadith is not reliable, but Wahhabis think it's reliable and they'll often cite it. All of us, and I said this once in the khutbah, and I think it disturbed some people, there is an awful morgue here in LA. It processes over 100 bodies a day. It's awful because when you see it, there's just bodies everywhere. And if you die in LA, all of us will end there, and eventually in the ground. And that reminder think of what happens after. Now, most of us as human beings, and this is what the surah is coming to, don't want to reflect on that. But it is like thinking of retirement. You're going to get there, regardless of how much you want to ignore the, you're going to pass through the stages, unless, of course, now that is even more final than something like retirement or old age or marriage or whatever it is. It's more final because you might get to retirement, but you might not. There's a level of speculation there. But death is where we all going to go. Now, if you believe nothing happens beyond death, then there's no engagement with you. Then you die and it's over. And then you're not a Muslim. I mean, I think that, but if you believe the message of the Quran, that life is a phase of transition to the beyond, then there are common grounds to engage you. Okay, so what happens after we die? What happens after we visit the graves? Now, and again, I hope I don't bore you with the level of the extent to which how I am always impressed by what the intellectuals of the Muslim civilizations achieved, contrasted with my disappointment with what modern Muslims achieve. Because of their commentary on كَلَّا سَوْفَ تَعْلَمُونَ ثُمَّ كَلَّا سَوْفَ تَعْلَمُونَ كَلَّا لَوْ تَعْلَمُونَ عِلْمَ الْيَقِينِ لَتَرَوُنَّ الْجَحِيمَ. Okay, so then you will no. كَلَّا it means no, but like I guess in English you can say it to affirm something. No, this indeed this will happen, or verily this will happen. So you will come to know. Now the Quran, Allah fully acknowledges that we live life in various states. As sure as we are about death, our consciousness, when it comes to what happens after death, rarely reaches the level of certitude. As human beings, because we are what we are, we live in various degrees of dhann, of probability of belief about what happens after death. At the moments in which the light enters us, the luminous substance of Allah enters our hearts the most, we feel near certitude about our fate after death. And we are at peace with that. Or we are at extreme anxiety about that, depending on what we've done on earth. We are, as Grace said, we are fully conscious of our own material existence and what we've done with this material existence. But we live most of our existence very adept at levels of addictive behavior that distracts us from that state of certitude. And so we struggle with that belief. It is, I mean, in our modern day, in the past, they used to talk about playing backgammon and chess to distract yourselves from thinking about the hereafter. In our modern days, I guess the equivalent would be video games. Of course, how many of you sort of felt annoyed, irritated with yourself, and so played video games or computer games or whatever? No?
Be honest.
God, you're all,
up to it.
you're all saints. Well, I guess it's a lower age. Younger people, that means you're old, by the way. If you haven't realized this means you're old people, because the younger generation does that. All I see them is on the phones. Okay, let's take phones. How many of you used phones to distract yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
Facebook.
Okay. Now, of course, I revealed my age, and you know, it's yeah. Anyway, so okay, Facebook, whatever the distractions are, some of the most fascinating commentaries is that, and again, we are human beings that exist struggling with shak. We are anxious human beings. We are human beings that struggle with the anxiety of wanting, sometimes aching to have the certitude. We can think of death as, and understand it logically, but wanting the knowledge of, or the feeling of certitude about what unfolds after death, but it often eludes us. And that's why Allah comes and emphasizes. It's as if Allah is saying, you know, when you have the style of repeating something in order to affirm it. Despite all your doubts, despite all the tumultuous existence that you've been in, back and forth between belief and non-belief, or belief and suspicion, between feeling your iman is solid and your iman is less than solid, back and forth in your existence, it's Allah comes and says, no, it will become certain. You will come to know. Indeed, you will come to know. Again, think of the emotive impact if you allow this revelation to penetrate into your heart. And you will come to know the truth of things, the reality of things. And when you do, what you lived coveting, aspiring for, certitude, through existence, will materialize before your eyes, so it becomes undeniable. Now here, again, I often comment about the Muslim intellectual legacy. What's quite fascinating is ilm al-yaqeen. This expression, know if you only knew, indeed you'll come to know indeed you will, in the end you will come to know indeed if you only knew for certain. The tense here, the certitude that will come in the hereafter, if only you had had that certitude in your temporal life. Now here, the commentaries and the intellectual reflections on this verse are fascinating. Because many commentators, like Al-Maturidi, the famed Maturidi, the founder of the famous theological school and so on, says that ilm al-yaqeen is what, he divides certitude into three types. There's ilm al-yaqeen, certain knowledge, ayn al-yaqeen, what's the translation of ayn al-yaqeen? Eye of certainty, haqq al-yaqeen, truth of certainty. And roughly, ilm al-yaqeen, certain knowledge, is a type of knowledge that comes from an accumulation of indicators that are not necessarily undeniable, but reach a probability of something. Ayn al-yaqeen, the eye of certainty, is knowledge that reaches beyond probability to an undeniable level. So it's like seeing something or touching something. Ibn Arabi summarizes it in witnessing something. the higher level of knowledge, what they call the haqq al-yaqeen, or the truth of knowledge, which is knowledge that comes from direct illuminations or revelations from the divine. So in a way, they sometimes call it sapiential, meaning a revelation, an emanation, something that you know because of direct divine intervention into your heart. And it goes beyond what you can point to through indicators and beyond what is undeniable because it reached a level of certainty. All of human existence is spent mostly in ilm al-yaqeen wa ayn al-yaqeen, that in certain knowledge and the eye of certitude. What you seek after is the truth of certitude, haqq al-yaqeen. There's fascinating material that you can read in Futuhat al-Makkiyah, Ibn Arabi and other Tafsir about these three levels of certitude. Going into them would take us hours, but it's a sort of a taste of how, and again, we don't brag about ancestors, we learn from them, how your ancestors, how seriously they took the revelation and how deeply they thought about the revelation. For our purposes, because we're not going to spend hours on the three levels of yaqeen and how you can achieve them and so on. But a little hint, the Quran itself tells us, فَعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيكَ الْيَقِينَ, so worship your God until certitude comes to you. And that in itself, it's a summation of the path, that you want the truth of certitude. There's only one way you can achieve it, and that's by making God fully into your life and by ibadah, by worship. We don't worship because it's ritualistic. That's the minimum. The rituals simply keep you into a minimum relationship with Allah. The more time you spend worshiping, the more Allah allows you to go through the levels of certitude. Now, if you do not do that, then, as Surah At-Takathur tells you, it will become undeniable after death. That's a promise from God, that after death, what you've spent a lifetime struggling with will become undeniable. Now, لَا تَرَوُنَّ الجَّحِيمَ. I'm going to skip over the debate about whether all of us will visit hellfire and then be saved from hellfire by the grace of Allah, or will we simply for sure see hellfire. If you're interested in that debate, again, that's an entire halaqa in itself. Whether all of us go into hell and are saved or not. But what is certain, what is promised you by God, is that you will see the consequences. You will see the hisab. And al-jahim here, some of the best or some of the most attractive views that I've read on this is that whether it is actual hellfire or the process of consequences, hisab, that the accountability for the deeds. So, for instance, Al-Maturidi says, إن كل واحد منا يعلم قبح الكذب والظلم وحسن الصدق والعلم ولكن لا يعلم آثار ذلك ومقدار ذلك ونتائجه وذلك من حساب الجحيم. All of us know theoretically that lying is bad and that injustice is bad. And all of us know theoretically that saying the truth is good and that justice is good. But what you don't know, or what you speculate upon, is the full consequences of lying and the full consequences of injustice. The full extent of the ugliness of injustice, or the full extent. So for instance, when we think of, I often reflect upon human beings that torture another human beings or kill another human being. If they truly reflected upon the full implication of the ugliness of the deed, some of us even think about injustice and don't take it seriously. You find Muslims today that, for instance, defend a ruler despite the fact that he murdered someone in an embassy. You find some of us defending. You find some of us, for instance, these days, another ruler who murdered about 4,000 people in a public arena and has imprisoned 100,000 and sentenced hundreds to death, tore down 1,000 mosques, and you find some Muslims today who will not take a stand. We'll talk about that's normal, as if that's justifiable or acceptable at some level. If they thought about simply لَتَرَوُنَّ الْجَحِيمَ, you will come face to face with the full consequences of your positions. Completely stark naked with the full consequences of the positions you've took. If you blew someone up, can you imagine the jahim, the hell of accountability of someone who blew himself up and killed 100 people in a mosque? Do you know that in Mulad al-Nabawi, the occasion of the birth of the Prophet, there's someone who went in a mosque, right? Can you imagine when in the hereafter they are confronted with the full consequences of the children who became orphaned, of who went into poverty, of who suffered, the consequences down generations. Now, if you think of this at a mini level, think of every possible lie that you or I might have said. Every act of injustice that you or I might have done. And think not of the act, but what unfolds from the act. To be confronted with the full consequences, because then the veils are stripped and Allah will collapse space and time so that you see in an instant what unfolded from every deed of goodness and every deed of evil. That, as numerous commentators have pointed out, is Jahim in itself. Now, of course, we believe as Muslims that you will pay for the consequences, that there is no such thing as a free ride. And just to remind you, that is a material difference between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In Christianity, it is possible that God would not achieve justice in the end because you accepted Jesus, Jesus loves you, all is forgiven, a serial killer is equal to a saint at the end, if through the salvation of Jesus, the love of Jesus. It's a free ride for many. In Judaism, whether there is a hereafter is even debatable. Most Jewish scholars at this point say there is no hereafter. It's all on this world. Once you die, now of course, whether there in the medieval era, there are a lot of Jewish scholars that say strongly speak that. But if you talk to most rabbis today, they tell you, no, this thing about hellfire and heaven, it's a myth. In Islam, it's a face of justice. Justice. What to the minutia of detail, people will be held to account for what they've done and what they've deluded themselves in doing. Now, of course, absolute justice, if it engages us philosophically for all these centuries, and you can read about it your entire life and still achieve very little knowledge about with the philosophy of justice, you can imagine that's so. Now, لَتَرَوُنَّ الْجَحِيمَ ثُمَّ لَتَرَوُنَّهَا عَيْنَ الْيَقِينِ. You will see, if only you know for certain, you will come to see hellfire. Is this Maghrib? You will definitely see hellfire, then you will see it with the eye of certainty. Now, the eye of certainty, this is where a lot of the talk or a lot of the commentaries about the levels of certainty, the difference between the eye of certainty and the truth of certainty and the knowledge of certainty comes in, as we said. And then the final ayah, the final verse, ثُمَّ لَتُسْأَلُنَّ يَوْمَئِذٍ عَنِ النَّعِيمِ, then you will be held to account for all, and the na'im is not pleasures, it's everything that you are allowed to make use of and enjoy. Now here, of course, another hadith that the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, this one far more authentic, is the لا تزول قدم عبد, that a human being after death, and again it's reported that the Prophet commented on this Surah At-Takathur saying this, that a human will be asked عن عمر فيما أفناه, that his life and how he spent it, his knowledge and what he's done with it, وعن ماله فيما أبلاه, and his money and what he's done with it. Have I forgotten any? ماله من أين اكتسبه فيما أنفقه, عن جسمه فيما أبلاه. That's right. And his body and what he's done with. So your life, your knowledge, your money, and your body, consistent with much of what we were saying, that the accountability is total and holistic. For me, Surah At-Takathur has always reminded me in the moments in which I struggle with certitude. I simply remind myself that certitude, my belief, my faith, tells me that, and from Allah's revelation to all of us as human beings, that certitude is coming, no escape from it, because death is coming. And upon death, I will see things with the eye of certitude. And that often affirmed my faith. Simply that memory, simply reminding myself of that, often re-anchors me. I don't know if it's the same for you, But that thought often re-anchors me. The emphatic promise by Allah that if you are wise, think of what will become undeniable, and the accountability of things invites you to reflect upon the full consequences of your deeds. I mean, quite often, if you reflect upon the consequences of the deed, it no longer appears small to you. And if you remember that that there will be a demand to fully explain yourself, you watch what you say and what you do far more carefully. And that's the moral intervention of the Quran. A conscious living. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. And that's Surah At-Takathur. Okay, so we'll pray Maghrib and then we'll
Do some Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to just do some Q&A if anyone has.
I want to say something before. Can I say?
Of course.
Yeah. Just before the questions, and I maybe this will resolve the question. I don't know. But I can't resist the temptation to say, we're living during turbulent times, and they're turbulent because for many reasons, but among them, they're when a superpower like the United States, with all its role, elects a leadership that has a certain moral vision or lack of moral vision, inevitably that's going to have consequences upon our entire world. And it's just, the truth of the matter is that if you follow the news around the world, American elections is as much an internal affair for everywhere in the world as it is in the U.S. I mean, the irony is, if we wanted an entirely fair world, the entire world should vote in the American elections, because whoever is the president of the U.S. ends up affecting the entire universe. But I want to just say something about some developments that I get a lot of messages about and seem to the developments in Saudi in particular are noteworthy. Among the theologies in contemporary Islam that have emerged is a theology known as the Jami Salafi, or sometimes called Al-Jamiyya Al-Madkhaliyya Salafiyya, which is a very interesting theology because it as if it harkens back to the early Umayyad period, and adopts a lot of doctrines of belief that popped up in early Islam and that died off, but have been reborn today. And Jamia Salafiyya, we can summarize it in that it is everything in the Wahhabi creed. They're fully embraced Wahhabis. They fully adopt the theology of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, al-Wala' wal-Bara', the entire thing. They're very hostile to Shia, they're very hostile to Sufis, they're very hostile to rationalism. They're depending on who you talk to, they're hostile to Ash'arism, etc., etc. But the main distinctive thing about them is that they strictly and absolutely forbid rebellion, not just rebellion, but disobedience to the ruler, even thinking in thoughts of the ruler. So for instance, this Khashoggi thing, if they issued a number of fatwa that says, if you believe or if you even suspect, you start thinking that maybe Mohammed bin Salman did kill Khashoggi, then that's a grave sin. And what distinguishes them is that while the vast majority of schools in Islam have said لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق, that if you're obeyed to commit a sin, then you cannot obey. Jamia don't accept that, and they believe that even if the ruler orders you to commit a sin, you must obey. And among the recent things is, even if the ruler fornicates for half an hour on public TV every day, you can't disobey the ruler, you cannot rebel against the ruler, you cannot think ill of the ruler. Another one of their shuyukh said that even if the ruler exterminates 1/3 of the population, you cannot think ill of the ruler, you cannot disobey the ruler, etc., etc. Now, of course, if there's a lot of, whether they're an invention of, there are a lot of conspiracy stuff that's going around, that they're an invention of the CIA. The Israeli spokesman for the Israeli army came on public TV and praised them and endorsed them, and so there's a lot of talk about that they're an invention of the Mossad. Some tell you that they're an invention of Egyptian intelligence, they're an invention of Pakistani intelligence, they're an invention of Saudi intelligence. They're probably an invention of all of them put together. I mean, intelligence agencies work together. The remarkable thing about Jamia Salafiyya is that they're extremely convenient for the secular rulers in Egypt. They're extremely convenient for the rulers in the United Arab Emirates. They're very convenient for the rulers in Syria, because they strictly forbid any form, and they think democracy is an absolute haram because it allows people to have an opinion when the ruler has a different opinion. So even Jamia Salafiyya popped up when the confirmation of that Supreme Court Justice, Kavanaugh, and we had a Jami Salafi Sheikh tell us that it's haram if you think that Kavanaugh sexually harassed that woman, because that's what the ruler Trump wants, and so it's mind-boggling. Now, why would it would be intellectual curiosity, sort of a funny curiosity, if it hadn't been for the fact that Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi government has imprisoned all the shuyukh in Saudi, all the Wahhabi shuyukh, including Wahhabi shuyukh, who have criticized Jamia Salafiyya, or who have even refused to endorse the Jamia Salafiyya. So all of the famous names, including remarkably respectable scholars, have been thrown in prison, and Allahu Alam if they're still alive or not. In the Emirat has done the same. Egypt, it's even worse, because every sheikh that have disagreed with Shuyukh al-Jamia Salafiyya has been thrown in prison. And so the Wahhabi creed that exists today is not traditional Wahhabi creed. The traditional Wahhabism has been completely betrayed by the Saudi government and has been abandoned. The type of Wahhabism that is now going to be propagated and funded around the world, and you're already seeing the seeds of that in the US and in Europe, is a Jamia Salafi. Absolute and blind obedience to the ruler, Sufism is haram, Shiism is haram, but among them is a very odd theology that Jerusalem was never important in Islamic history, that they even gone as far as defiling Salah ad-Din and attempting to impeach figures in Islamic history like Salah ad-Din, because in Islamic history he's known as the liberator of Jerusalem, that in Masjid al-Aqsa is not actually in Palestine, it's somewhere in Arabia, a little abandoned building that no one actually knows where it precisely is. And it just means, Masjid al-Aqsa just means the far mosque. It doesn't mean what all of history we've known as the Mubarak, the spot that is blessed by Allah. Very, very odd. Now, of course, it doesn't surprise you that remarkably they've also discovered that the priority for the Islamic nation is to fight the Shia, and the Palestinians are not important for Muslims. So throughout, and again, you're finding this with some, the seeds of it are starting to sprout. Even in the West, where you have very respectable scholars completely silent when the Palestinians start to be slaughtered in Palestine, and completely abandon the Palestinian issue, and I'm saying this because I know that for the people that hear me on the net and all the messages I get and so on, I can see no greater corruption of Islam than that. Because it systematically takes away your rationalist tradition, your mystical tradition, your spiritual tradition of Sufiya. It takes away your theological tradition, whether the various schools of thought, whether Maturidiyya or Mu'tazila or Shia or Ismaili or whatever it denies the legitimacy of doctrinal history, and it effectively leaves you with nothing other than an opportunistic obedience to politics. Whatever politics wants, that is the will of Allah. It is the complete stripping down of Islam into nothing but a purely opportunistic, materialistic dogma. Because if the ruler among it is that you cannot envy the rich, you cannot covet what the rich have, you cannot even ask the rich to give you anything. So it is a complete, when Marx talked about opiate of the people, it is the complete nightmarish fulfillment of religion as an opiate of the people. I wouldn't have worried about it if it hadn't been for the fact that now oil money, petrodollars, is behind the Jamia Salafi. And that it is being funded now as the type of Islam that they want everywhere. And of course, it is fully endorsed by Israel, it's fully endorsed by the US, and we're finding the Jami Salafi scholars remarkably get visas to lecture all over the US and Europe and so on and so forth. It is my obligation to bear witness, and I must bear witness to that absolute evil. It is nothing could be ethically more bankrupt, in my view, than betraying an entire people whose land has been occupied, destroyed, usurped, and basically told them you're homeless and you're nationless, and so you will remain. and then looking at the millions of refugees in Syria and saying, okay, well, you should just go back and just accept the ruler, your tyrant as your ruler and obey him, and it's your fault that you're refugees. And basically it is the laying moral blame on victims of injustice throughout. I don't know what Quran they read. And this is not the context to respond to them theologically, but you must be aware that the old Wahhabism is effectively dead. The new Wahhabism is this. Yeah.
As if it wasn't bad enough.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't even. Yeah, I mean, it's then Islam becomes, because if you strip people of the power to object against injustice by the nature of sociological dynamics, you are going to exasperate patriarchy to an extreme. Because if men cannot assert empowerment within private spaces, who do they think they're going to exercise power over? And mothers will exercise it over children. I mean, it's stripping of Islam to a very vulgar dynamics of sheer power and the legitimation and of power wherever it may exist. Of course, there are a lot of contradictions because, for instance, the Jajami Salafis supported the coup in Egypt. So why wasn't Morsi the ruler that should be obeyed and Sisi is the ruler that should be obeyed? Why is it okay to rebel against their government in Iran? Well, they say they're Shia, so they're all no obedience. Why should you have not obeyed the rulers of ISIS? Because they say it's okay to rebel against the rulers of ISIS, but it's not okay to rebel against Assad or the rulers of the Emirat, or so they don't make sense. I'm not trying to make them sound like they make sense, but remarkably, that's the type of Islam that is being funded now, and that's where the resources are being poured. So women watch out, men watch out, minorities, everyone that has a sense of humanity and decency. I find it, of course, I could be completely wrong. I find it difficult to believe that that's the type of Islam that will catch on. But money does wonders. I mean, I've seen people, for the sake of money, lie to themselves in amazing ways. There are some shuyukh in Egypt that I know who transformed suddenly to completely Jami Salafis, who I thought would not. So, maybe I'm naive in thinking that it's not going to catch on, but I hope I'm right, that it's too idiotic, to put it simply, to catch on. But the only voices of theological voices that's coming out of Saudi right now are all Jami Salafis. You might have heard the Sudaisus khutbah in the Haram. Anyway, that's all I want to my part. The floor is yours. Sir.
You said, like, I think a week ago, if I'm not mistaken, that basically, like, if you take a top-down approach, basically the populace will not take that lightly, and they'll try to rebel against that. I'm sorry if I'm misconstruing your argument.
You're talking about the lecture I gave at UCLA, right?
Yeah. So basically, do you think that because of all this pushing down, the top-down processing of this, like, whatever this new Wahhabism that you say it is, do you think that the general populace will have those kind of feelings, or will just money trump it all?
No, there's a difference between when we talk about top-down approach, we're referring to the historical phenomena of sort of the reformer enlightened despot, where a despotic ruler decides that to institute what the ruler believes is reform from the top down, and does it through not the process of enticements, because money is enticement. Money could be a way of trying to persuade people, but it does it by the sheer threat of force, and that type of reform has a corrupting effect on people, because it might change the laws of society, but it has a deep impact psychologically. And social psychology now is a very complicated science, and we know a great deal about what that approach does in terms of teaching people hypocrisy, duality in discourse, the indefinite, the way that society starts formulating meaning and negotiating meaning in ways that completely defeat honesty and transparency in society. And so the impact of that type of top-down despotism is devastating sociologically, and but the danger in enticements of money, that's not what is usually meant by top-down, because money is a form of persuasion. You could, but it's an immoral form of persuasion, but it's a form of persuasion. And you can try to persuade people by feeding them, paying them, convincing them. There are a variety of ways you can try to persuade people. There are forms of persuasion that are immoral and have a corrupting effect, like money, because you teach, what you do when you do that is you commodify everything. And when you persuade through money in the religious context, you commodify religion. You teach people that not to trust the normative moral principles that, because it's like, to put it bluntly, the text tells them you should live by principles, not by money. But what they see all around them is that people are living by money. And so that duality teaches a deep schizophrenia in society. And we've seen that in our modern societies all over. On the one hand, and it started from colonialism. Because colonialism, rough colonialism like Dutch colonialism and Spanish colonialism didn't persist, and were not nearly as lethal as French colonialism and British colonialism, which had long-term, deep-seated consequences because they produced incentives and not sheer brutality and sheer force. And you see the impact of the way that they've changed culture long-term. But beyond colonialism, far more important, I think, is the effect of petrodollars on Muslim culture. And we see it even in every part of our everyday life. It's very hard to get Muslims to believe the idea of living by principles when that's not the reality that surrounds them. And they see that money talks, and money talks in the religious sphere. And so it's very difficult to trust religious doctrine when the practice is quite different. That, I think, personally, I wish that oil would run out. I think that would be the greatest gift to Muslims. That just oil would run out, and of course, I would be happy if we go back to horses and donkeys and stop driving cars, and but I don't think I will be alive to see that. Maybe our grandchildren will get to enjoy that. They don't create an alternative. They don't turn water into fuel or something like that, which apparently they already did, but it was anyway. theologically, I don't believe that history unfolds away from the sight of God. And I believe that everything that takes place in history, there are tests to human beings, individuals, and there are tests to nations. And that in the same way that every individual could overcome a test and a challenge to unfold a new qadar, a new fate, nations can overcome a challenge and to unfold a new qadar and fate. And there are failures at the level of an entire nation in the same way that there are failures at the entire of individuals. The thing about nations, though, is that the sum total of individuals. And collective failure is often a result of the failure of many individuals at a certain historical moment. I mean, that's a larger issue, but when I reflect on the entire legacy of the blessing and the curse of oil, it could have been truly transformative post-colonialism for the entire Islamic civilization. And it's very interesting that it all came about right at the end of colonialism. It's as if it's a gift at a critical turning point in history. The fact that it went so badly is a result of the collective decisions of individuals, and I can point to numerous points in history where I can see a different trajectory, but that's where we are now, and I don't believe that we are allowed at any point in our existence to give up. Because giving up means you don't believe that the world has an owner, ultimately, a malik. And as long as the world has an owner, then you must believe that this owner can, in an instant, change everything. Any questions about the Takathur?
I have a question, but the mood is totally different now.
I mean, I'm responsible for that because I talked about Jami Salafi. No, is it about the Takathur or about something else?
No, about the Takathur.
Oh, about the Takathur, okay. Your questions are usually very deep, so hold on with any less deep questions.
No,
First, before we go to the deep question.
I don't.
I'm not saying it necessarily deep this time, I'm just saying usually very deep.
Okay. That's
better.
That's better. That's better.
Okay?
I did.
Okay, sorry.
Mine is usually very easy. So, I have a question. Is there any pattern between this one and then Al-Humaza? You know, I think in Al-Humaza, one of the verses basically for someone who likes to, be proud of their own portfolio, in accumulating money. And then there's a previous one, in Surah Al-Adiyah, I think it's about horses. So why is there...
We didn't get to the Adiyat al-Abha. Yeah, so that has a whole different thing. But,
Okay.
yeah.
So why is the emphasis is about materialistic stuff? What about says like, these days, people post picture on Instagram, it's about how many likes will I get? And then that would be
But
like
it is the Humaza addressed, or Surah Al-Humaza addressed a class of people that live a lifestyle of a social vanity and hedonism. And I mean, if we would sum it up, in they gossip, they put down other human beings. They're constantly in a state of arrogant social consciousness. They think they're better than everyone, and they constantly criticize everyone for instead of looking inward. Al-Takathur is broader than that, because it talks about our tendency to lose sight of the meaning of our existence through addictive endeavors. Now, these addictive endeavors could be the accumulation of money, and it could be selfies. I mean, it's not necessarily, it is any addictive behavior that prevents you from reflecting upon the essence of existence itself, which is just existence, or in mizan, in balance, or the priority and the first principle of morality, and that is justice. So if you want to sum up the first moral principle of anything, it's a principle of justice. Justice with yourself, justice with your others, justice in society, justice between the here now and the hereafter, justice with your children. Justice is the heart of everything. It's in the same way that causality in philosophy has a first cause, in ethics, morality has a first principle. And that first principle is justice. And the entire surah is a reminder that, and again, the takathur could be increasing in the accumulation or the increasing or the perpetuation of anything. If your thing is selfies, and that becomes a form of what's the word I'm looking for? Self-worship. There's an word that's
Idolatry.
Idolatry. A form of idolatry. Then that applies. Now, but to be fair, the Quran does often, very often, target material accumulation, because of all the temptations that exist to humanity. Probably the hardest is money. It is the toughest god to beat. Even tougher for most people than sex and other things. Money is tough because it demands attention, and it's a jealous bride. Once it has you, it doesn't share you, and it's very difficult to be able to break away from it once it enters your heart. Okay.
Well, I had two, but they're both related to At-Takathur. The first is verses 3 and 4. I was worrying about healthy distractions, because I found that if you sit and ruminate on the consequences of if you're always ruminating on the moral consequences of your actions, it can be paralyzing, and I don't think very good for one's mental health. And so I do think, and this comes from, T.S. Eliot has a quote, he's like one of my favorite poets, that says, mankind can't bear too much reality. And there's some truth in that, you'll go crazy. So what's the role of healthy distractions?
It's really interesting, because we often forget that the Prophet pointed repeatedly to sports as a healthy distraction. Now, of course, I am an offender in that. That's part of the sunnah that I can't claim that I've. So I mean, but that, I mean, there's a lot in that tradition, in the Islamic tradition, about the sports as a, of course, some of the writings that I find fascinating are the rasail that talk about music as a healthy distraction, in contradiction to those who forbade music. And one of the rasail that maybe someday I dream of editing and publishing is في فضل تعلم الآلات, the merits of learning a musical instrument as a healthy distraction from, and he has a wonderful introduction to the Risala where he says that he talks about the nafs al-lawama, the self, the accountable self, and how that he has seen some friends of his go from a nafs al-lawama to nafs al-waswasa, or waswas al-qahri, that they become obsessed and unstable, obsessed with, and that his teacher taught him the oud and the lute as in order to balance his ibadah and so on. And then he goes on. Most of the Risala talks about how to play the oud, but the introduction is very valuable because now again. I haven't followed that sunnah either, but I do listen to a lot of music. So I mean, it is now, of course, if God has created you with the psychology of an Ibn Arabi, which is quite rare, then that is. There are people that don't seem to, the more they reflect, even if it's constantly, but that's not most of us. Most of us cannot endure that. I didn't, it's not what I thought, but I'm happy you asked this question, because the problem in our modern age is usually the other way around, is that we don't give enough time to self-consciousness and to accountability before Allah and to the meaning of existence. But I'm happy you brought that up.
Well, sometimes, like, personally, sports and music, they're not like distractions from reflection, but sometimes they're the most humbling things because they are so difficult and require like your full faculty. So
I mean, I think you meant
maybe not distraction, but like something that would take you away from thinking about
accountability.
These sort of heavy, because it's
you can't. I mean, one, it is necessary to think of the consequences of what you have done fully, and to take a full inventory. How did you refer to it? I mean, we never coordinate what I'm going to say, but SubhanAllah, always...
Fearless moral inventory.
Yeah, fearless moral inventory. You can't live in it constantly and endlessly. But most people don't take fearless moral inventory. That's not my experience. I mean, if people are very good at deluding themselves that the inventory is very limited. I think if we did take a fairness more inventory, we would be far more compassionate human beings, and even in our jobs and our families and we just think very hard about what we do to others.
Can I, it's kind of related to what, is the surah
talking about distractions, or is it saying that because my translation says the striving for more distracts you, because it doesn't. It seems like there's a distinction between things that distract you in this life and this constantly wanting more, which is very tied into addiction. I need more, whatever it is, whether it's sex or money.
Yeah.
This and distracts you from.
Yeah, Takathur is it's an active form, and so it is really addictive behavior. It is striving for more. It is it's not the distraction, because that's not Takathur. Takathur is the impulse to constantly go after greater accumulation, a greater level.
And I think I'm thinking the same thing. For me, it seems like lahu is the more like valuable word in that ayah, right? Because it's not just the things that are abundant or yes, it's the ones that distract, the ones that put you in the state of lahu, right? So I guess in the same vein, couldn't you say also like an overabundance of fasting or an overabundance of prayer, that just distract you from...
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing I can think of, there's a very interesting discussion about Al-Haqq Takathur, whether it applies for the acquisition of knowledge, whether that could be a form, and they of course they were they weren't just talking about how much you read. They were talking about a form of speculative knowledge where people become addicted to the arguments itself.
Right.
And that's the closest that I've read to that. Yes, that if it interesting. I mean, that interesting footnote. There was a Tulsi Nasruddin Tulsi, who was a brilliant man, but as a scholar he has the infamy of, during the sack of Baghdad or after the sack of Baghdad, he worked in the service of the Mongols, and I read this really interesting passage about how could someone of the intelligence and the acumen of Tulsi accept working for a tyrant and a despot and a homicidal maniac like the Khans that he worked under. And it struck me that I can't remember the name of the book that now that I read this in, but anyway, that he mentioned that this is a man who has become addicted to the pursuit of knowledge in the abstract, that he lost his sense of accountability. So even moral pursuits like seeking knowledge, can make you. What is critical is being conscious of your accountability and the accountability of your actions. Mm-hmm. And so if you live in the service of a tyrant, that's going to have consequences. And if you're conscious of these consequences, it would be far more difficult to do it. But as we see every day, we human beings are very good at deluding ourselves that what's bad is actually good. And I don't know that there's a solution to that. I mean, I think it's just we as human beings are what we are. But what we're promised is that we will see things for the truth of what they are. So there's ultimately a point of accountability in which the veil is lifted. And that's a matter of aqidah. Okay, I don't want to discriminate against you.
No, you can if you think you're right.
No, go ahead and ask it.
I mean, the last point that you made, we all should go to the whole argument in fiqh about amalan sultan al-jair, if it is permitted to work for an unjust ruler or not, and what the benefits are and so forth, which takes us to another whole argument.
Debate.
Yeah, but I completely agree, and I mean, I join you and submit to your opinion that this surah is all about the relationship between knowledge and accountability. And what I feel about this surah is it puts a hierarchy of knowledge. It depicts a hierarchy of knowledge. That's why when you said talking about Ainul Yaqeen, Haqqul Yaqeen, and Ilmul Yaqeen takes a specific halaqa, who would be interested? I said yes. I raised my hand. I would be thrilled to sit in that halaqa.
That's such a long conversation because, as you know, that what I mean, they go from this enters into the entire debate on epistemology and the nature of truth and the nature of knowledge. And
exactly.
we go through then. We go through Ibn Sina and end up with Surah Wardi,
Ilm al-Hissi, Ilm al-Iktisabi, and so forth. And I think this surah talks to that. To that hierarchy and differentiation between the levels of knowledge. And I see, I mean, Ilm al-Yaqeen, of course, the roots of Ilm are alamat, the first indications, that first generations, let's say, put on the roads for them not to get lost when they wanted to come back. That's where probably the root of the word Ilm and Alama is. And then, so there is a level of sensual obtaining knowledge through your senses.
Sensory knowledge, yeah.
I think that's where Ilm al-Yaqeen. I mean, the repetition of Kalla Sawfa Ta'lamun, Summa Kalla Sawfa Ta'lamun. There's a difference between the first and the second, and I think there is that when you obtain Ilm al-Yaqeen, the things that you obtain, the knowledge that you obtain through your senses, I think that's where we can put it. Then you have another level of knowledge. That's where you see al-Jahim, which may not necessarily be Jahannam,
right.
But whatever you see can be an indicator. You use the word indicators in your interpretation. You may see indicators of what the real hell is, Jahannam is.
The reality of hell.
The reality of hell. And then again, ثُمَّ لَتَرَوْنَّهَا عَيْنَ الْيَقِينِ.
So then you can.
And you can see by your eyes.
I mean okay, yeah, go
and there is another summa. That's where you're being asked and you will be held accountable. So I think God gives human being several chances to obtain the knowledge that he needs to learn about the evilness of all the evils that he does in order to purify himself or correct himself. Correct yourself once, twice, three times. Get some sense about what you're doing. Of course, you've mentioned about the impact that our evils have on other people's lives. not just their physical lives, the generations after what we have done to the one that we.
Yeah.
And I think this talks about the levels of knowledge and certitude. Some people arrive at certain level of certitude with their knowledge that they obtained through their senses. That would be probably enough for them to stop and start doing good instead of what they used to do as evil. But still, some people may resist and say, again, those who doubt a lot, those who have tons of questions. I think this is one way of understanding this.
No, it
surah.
is. I mean, what I find, the thing I never end being amazed by, is that the Quranic revelation sparked a whole intellectual revolution. I mean, when you find that this surah has featured in inspiring the epistle of Hayy bin Yaqzan by Ibn Sina, and then later on by Ibn Tufayl, and then you find that it has generated this endless reflections on the nature of epistemology and the nature of learning from history. I mean, it's on the one hand, you know, when you approach a surah like this, the temptation is to, you know, is to draw people into the garden of intellectual delights that have already been opened by predecessors, because it amazes you that modern Muslims can pass by a surah like this again and again and again, and now for decades, endless people that have memorized it, and it never occurs to them any of these thoughts that had occurred to previous generations. I mean, you should see the way that they teach the surah in the schools I went. I mean, it literally means absolutely nothing other than, okay, you know, you're gonna go to hell and khalas, and in fact, there's emphasis that all of you will go to hell, and then some of us will be saved, and you know that's when you're absolutely right that it inspired a deep reflection on how we even acquire knowledge and how we go about learning, and the relationship between Allah and learning, and the rejection of the idea that we acquire knowledge without the participation of the divine in our life. So the Aristotelian sort of model that was that what Muslims contributed to is that they said, well, that's all wonderful, that this philosophical logic about epistemology and the nature of knowledge and knowing is wonderful, but it misses the divine, and they integrated the divine. So I mean, we didn't even. I thought it was interesting that when Grace spoke, she mentioned the hadith, whoever knows himself knows his God, because you read the way Ibn Arabi tied the surah into the three gradations, and how do you go from knowing the self to haqq al-yaqeen, and it's amazing, and it's an amazing tradition, and it's a tradition that you wish you can open a school to impart to generations of Muslims, because the idea that you have generations of Muslims that know nothing about this tradition, I mean, you know about it because you've spent all these years reading about it, and it's been a dedicated pursuit, but we should be teaching it to our children as part of their intellectual tradition, as part of their, here are what the different theories of knowledge and that Muslims have said. Yeah, I mean, I think what all of us can take away from that is that there is much more that you can read about and learn about just from Surah At-Takathur if you wanted to. You can spend hours reading commentaries on Surah At-Takathur. Compare that to the way we deal with the Quran today, as if there's nothing else to, we just take the most superficial meaning. I don't know how to strike the balance between going on for hours about the nature of knowledge, which and then no one will come back, and just giving enough to whet the appetite and move on.
Well, it's 6:11.
On that, just on that
construct of time that.
Sorry, so just on that last point about.
Last one.
Oh, it's not a question actually. It's just a suggestion that was brought up in the last session when I watched online about putting a few reading list topics maybe pertinent to, like, for example, on the Usuli website, where people can go.
If we're gonna, if it's in English or in all languages.
Whatever exists that's out there that.
You can probably help me do that, because the main thing is time. I mean, I've had that intention for a long time. We keep saying we're gonna do it, but
We're just overwhelmed, I'm sorry.
yeah, I mean, we're always really we're overwhelmed, but that's something that we should, because otherwise it's lost to its death. It takes an enormous.
You're in charge of bugging me.
And
that, or we will delegate to someone.
Okay, I have another suggestion. If we know what the topic of the Halaqa is, at least 2-3 days before.
We knew last night what today's topic was.
You didn't know, really?
Yeah, I can. We can decide.
I was driving home with him yesterday.
Oh, I see.
Do you know what surah you're covering?
Oh, okay.
And he's
Oh,
like,
these are the
are
ones
you
we do?
asking me just to be a pain in the butt, or because you need to know?
Okay, so next surah, inshallah, is 101 Al-Qari'ah.
101.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
101 Al-Qari'ah.
Thank you so much.
That's next halqa.
People ask me, I didn't know.
I have. I forgot what surahs we covered, so I had to I had to ask Grace to remind me what surahs we covered and what surahs we haven't. Because I mean, some of the surahs we covered go back years. I don't know, when did we start? A long time ago.
Late 90s. 96.
96.
Yeah,
What year are we in?
2019.
Almost
Yeah.
19. Don't
Not
get
yet.
ahead of yourself. Listen to our last few weeks.
Oh my lord. God, I feel like a complete failure. In 20 years, that's
We
all.
stopped for a long time.
Yeah, you stopped for like a decade.
Yeah.
Over a decade.
That's true.
And you did halaqas on prophet, building a partnership with God.
I mean, if it hasn't been for you, I
The
don't think we
hijab.
would have come back to the Tafsir, because I mean, no one had bugged me about going back to the Tafsir for a long time.
Yeah.
I actually thought that, okay, well,
And you wrote a few books.
Yeah, I was gonna say that.
we your students bugged you when we were studying under you. I mean, I remember vividly
that's true.
2005, 2006.
Yeah.
I asked you to start.
yeah,
Tafsir.
that's true. But
If it wasn't for
I'm
the fact
taking-
that I live
I'm
with
taking-
him, and I have to nag.
I,
And I've had to fight for these. wanted to keep it on topic.
The temptation is always to. It's much. There's always a book calling for you. You just want to escape go hide with your book.
Thank you so much, everyone.